Okay, let's start with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for giving us the supreme gift of life. We thank you for making us your sons and daughters, your offspring, made in your image and likeness. And Lord, we pray that as we consider these complicated issues today, that you would give us clarity of mind, compassion of spirit, and help us to understand how we can have an impact on the state of Oregon to defend even embryonic life. In Jesus' name, amen. So how many of you have been reading these stories about the girls born in China, the genetically modified twins? Anybody remember their names? Nana and Lulu. Aren't those cute names? I like those. But He Jiankui is the doctor who was responsible for this genetic modification. And what he was trying to do is make these girls not vulnerable to getting HIV. Now, how many of you, by raise of hand, would say that that is an honorable goal? Clearly, that conforms to the proper ends of medicine. Medicine and bioethics should attempt to prevent diseases or cure diseases, okay? Therapeutic purposes are legitimate, okay? But what was interesting was some of the reaction, even from the secular bioethics community, was not exactly positive. Have you guys heard some of this? Now, the first time I heard this in November, it was, you know, I like to yell at Alexa when I'm getting ready and shaving and stuff and say, okay, give me the news, you know. And Alexa will crank out an NPR little couple-minute ditty of news. And NPR, even their coverage, wasn't universally positive about this. So do you want to know some of the concerns raised by secular bioethicists about this issue? About these genetically modified twins? They raised concerns that this was unnecessary, that these twins were really not vulnerable to getting HIV anyway. So it was unnecessary. There were consent issues and deception. That is that when the parents signed the forms to consent to do this, the patients were given a consent form that falsely stated this was an AIDS vaccine trial and which conflated research with therapy by claiming that they were likely to benefit. Do you see the issue there? This was much more research than therapy, but it was worded as if it was therapy to get the signature. So the doctor was sort of trying to make this happen and telling people what they wanted to hear in order to make it happen. Now, if you know about secular bioethics today, the key value in secular bioethics is not sanctity of life, as in the way that we do ethics as Christians. The key value for them is autonomy. That is the person's free choice to receive some sort of treatment or therapy. It's all about the individual choice. But in order for autonomy to work out well for you, you have to have informed consent. And so dishonesty in terms of getting consent is a problem from a secular bioethics perspective. So even if you don't share a sanctity of life view, this was problematic. You guys can grab a seat. You're not going to distract me in the slightest if you make your way over there or get comfortable, okay? I'm looking back there, and there's a clock with no hands. I'm a preacher. You never take the hands off a clock. For the preach, I have no idea what time it is, therefore. You guys can just go through lunch, for all I know. But here's one of the other concerns raised by secular bioethicists, okay? And guys, this is all from an NPR article, okay? They raise concerns about safety. This guy from Harvard, George Daly, dean of Harvard Medical School, stressed that the world hasn't reached a scientific consensus on how to ethically and safely use new gene editing techniques to modify, watch this, embryos that become babies. Can somebody tell me what's being assumed in that last phrasing, embryos that become babies? That they're not currently babies? Yes, there might not become baby. And baby, of course, is not some precise term. What do they sort of seem to mean by this? They're not really human yet. Or at least, if they're more sophisticated, they may be human but not persons. Because in secular bioethics, again, like philosophers who defend the pro-choice position typically admit that the unborn are human, but are not what? Persons. And persons are subjects of rights because persons have value. So you can be a human and not have value and the right to life until you become person at birth or whatever point the individual bioethicist decides based on their criteria. But this guy from Harvard is, okay, yes, he's assuming that some of these are not persons, but he's also saying that we should have some level of concern or respect for them, even if they're not fully persons. So even secular bioethics says you should be respectful towards embryos. Now, if they still think that you should be able to kill them, I don't see quite how you can respectfully kill as opposed to disrespectfully kill embryos. But the point is, I'm trying to portray that there is some common ground that we can find with secular bioethicists about these sorts of issues, okay? Okay, and by the way, the scientist here, He Jiankui, was fired by his university. He's under investigation by the Chinese government for violations and all this sort of thing, which might give you almost the false impression that the world isn't really wanting this type of genetic manipulation to happen. But there is a desire for it. They just want it done within certain parameters. So let's not get it twisted, okay? We want to genetically modify people to prevent diseases and maybe even enhance people in a widespread way in our society. That movement, that wave has been forming for decades, okay? And it's really an extension of the eugenics stuff from the early to mid-20th century. You know, Hitler wanted the Aryan race to multiply like jackrabbits, but not those other people over there that he deemed defective, right? There are various ways that people on evolutionary assumptions have tried to improve the human race. Now, you may do that by choosing who can reproduce and who can't, who lives and who dies to be able to reproduce. That was Hitler's eugenic approach, okay? And of course, you know, Margaret Sanger shared some of those eugenic assumptions and all that. But this is just another way to do it. Play with the genetics. Okay? Okay. Now, of course, one of the other things brought up by secular bioethicists about this was the possibility of designer babies. That they spoke of this possibility that maybe people will end up choosing what sorts of children to have and this sort of thing. So I want to show you, this was something you can find readily online about the CRISPR technique, and this is kind of the science of it. I don't want to go through all the details of this because I want to get to some ethical reasoning stuff here. But it's just kind of, you know, you want to target the bad genes and replace them with good genes and this sort of thing. But the bottom of that chart goes through some possible uses or what's next with gene editing technology. And on the left is food and livestock modification. How many of you would like, you know, more protein, less fat, or whatever? You know what I'm saying? I mean, those sorts of things that relate to nutrition. That second one there is gene drive. I don't want to go through all that stuff right now. Let's stick with stuff relevant to humans more. Gene therapy. Gene therapy, they try to treat some adults diseases or prevent their disease. It's more like treatment, though, by targeting bad genes for either replacement or those sorts of things. Now, how many of you know that some adults have actually died or been harmed significantly in the process of gene therapy in the last couple decades? Did you know this? Okay, Jesse, I forget his last name now. Gelsinger, something like this, was the first known death. This was back in, I want to say around 98 or something like that. Sophia Kolomainen has written about the harm caused by attempts to gene edit adults. This guy was 18 years old, and they were trying to modify his genes to take care of his disease, and he died within about a 4-day span of receiving his gene editing treatment. But since then, from then to it was about 2004 or so when Kolomainen wrote this article that I read, 619 or so other people had been significantly harmed as reported by the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. So this is underway, and people are sometimes being harmed in the process of trying to master this technology of gene editing. And then there's human germline. Now, here's the germline therapy is when you do something to the genetics of a person that will carry over into every future generation reproduced by that person. So now notice, if you modify my genes and then I have children, I've got one of my children right there. See her, Jamie. She's the one squinting right now, okay. She's a freshman at Northwest University, Kirkland. Kind enough to meet me here in Portland. So, but I've got 2 daughters. But let's say I was going to have more kids and I had germline therapy done. Whatever they do to my genes will pass on to all of my offspring. So now those changes, for good or for better or worse, are foisted upon people who don't have the power to choose yes or no to that. And what did I say was the number one most important choice? And autonomy is the key to secular bioethics. So now there's no consent, and so autonomy is being violated of my children. Now, if something bad happens, some sort of if there's a problem that stems from the gene editing, they get that too, and it wasn't their choice. And even if it's a good thing, let's say, now it's giving me a level of control over their traits, and maybe I pressure them towards some sorts of life choices and not others because, no, this is what's in your genetics. Okay, we'll get into some other concerns about this, but let me just step back for a second and give you a couple of other ways. Okay, here's the other thing. Designer organisms, and we're going to get into that a bit more in a minute. Now, how many of you realize that there are a lot of unborn, little embryos that will have to be experimented on to get this process right? And that have been experimented on to get this process right. That means, of course, a lot of embryos are going to die and be deformed and all the, of course they're going to kill them and not allow them to come to birth, but that's just the point, is that this is a threat to embryonic life. Life at its earliest stages. I want to just mention a couple of other threats to embryonic life, though. How many of you are familiar with embryonic stem cell research, ESCR? Okay. The basic idea of embryonic stem cell research is, stem cells are fast-growing, unspecialized cells that, because they're unspecialized, they can grow and be adapted to develop different tissues of the body. And you can get stem cells from multiple sources. You can get them from adults. You can get them from the placenta. of a woman after birth. And those ways don't kill the person you're getting the stem cells from. And they've developed well over 70 different cures for various maladies and diseases from adult stem cells and cord blood and these other ethical sources. And nobody had to die for that. Isn't that a great thing? Now, I'm not going to ask, but some of you may have even been treated in this way. They've done amazing things, even helped restore sight to people who are having serious vision problems. But embryonic stem cell research draws the stem cells from embryos, which means what happens to the embryos? They die, that's right, okay? But it's all for a good cause. It's going to save lives, right? We're going to use these people, kill them, to benefit other people. Now, if you're not okay with that, hey, what's your problem with Superman? Because Superman, this is the only Superman that I really cared about as a kid, right? Christopher Reeves, right? Okay? Somehow, you thought kryptonite was his weakness. It turns out horse riding was his real weakness because he was paralyzed in an accident. And he was wanting stem cell research, embryonic stem cell research, to go forward to help find a cure for this. Now, how many of you would like to see cures for paralysis and spinal cord injuries? Absolutely we would. But do you want to choose that some people die in order for other people to benefit? Okay, so people shouldn't be used as means, they should be treated as ends. The sanctity of life that we believe in means people should be treated as ends and not just means. Okay. Or what's your problem with Marty McFly? I thought he played the snot out of Johnny Be Good. You know what I'm saying? I mean, so, because he has Parkinson's, okay? And they were hoping that embryonic stem cell research would be used to help cure Parkinson's. So the world has sort of framed this ESCR issue as something like, one, you must not have a lot of compassion for people if you're basically choosing some embryo you don't even know over real flesh and blood people who are suffering. And in the name of what? Your religion? Imposing your religious view? As if the valuing embryos could only be for religious reasons? That's the way that they've typically set this debate up. There are other ways in which, of course, embryonic life is threatened. Cloning. But cloning, we're getting a little ahead. Cloning is just essentially, because the world is not at a place where they're trying to reproduce clones. I mean, this is not Star Wars world where they need an army, so they're just going to crank out clones until they've got enough to battle the battle droids. You know what I'm saying? People typically are a little weirded out by that clone reproduction idea. What a relief, right? Well, but people advocate for cloning for therapeutic purposes, which means clone and kill and extract the stem cells. In other words, they're reproducing life in order to kill those lives and extract the stem cells for not their benefit, but for other people's benefit. Again, clone and kill bills. And you have several states that require such killing. What's really something grotesque, really, is New Jersey, the most outrageous clone and kill policy. They'll let these clones grow for 9 full months before they're killed in order that they may harvest their somewhat more developed organs. This is called fetus farming. 2004, they okayed that law in New Jersey. But there's no federal policy on this, so states kind of have some leeway about which way they're going to go on these sorts of things. And of course, the other way that by the way, if we compare the number of embryos affected by all of these different things, the one I'm about to say affects more embryos than all of the others combined, I'm sure. And it's just chemical abortion. Between things like abortifacient contraception and emergency contraception, which actually allows conception to occur but keeps the embryo from implanting in the uterus and therefore being able to live. Intrauterine devices. How many of you have seen those very cheerful Kyleena commercials? They've been all over for about a couple of years now. But these are just intrauterine devices. Now, they may try to prevent conception by thickening the fluid in there and maybe a spermicide or whatever it is. But in the event that conception does take place, Plan C or something in the method is to prevent implantation in the uterus. So if you fail to prevent day 0 here, fertilization, well, we could at least keep implantation from happening day 8 or 9, and then this, taking root and growing into a fetus and then a person. So we have killed, about 62 million fetuses legally by abortion in the United States since 1973. If you count worldwide, it's somewhere around 1.4 billion, I think it's something like that. But the uncounted and uncountable number is how many embryos have been killed by these methods right here, chemical abortions. Now, let's talk ethics. Let's talk about what should or should not happen. That's just an introduction to what is happening. So what should or shouldn't happen? And I am going to need arms on a clock, so let me pull my cell phone out and try to keep track of how late it's getting. I'm not going to judge by how loudly your stomachs are growling. 11:39. Okay, I've got about 25 minutes. Okay, so a few things. What's the problem? Let's talk about what is the problem with designer babies, okay? The notion of basically gene editing your offspring and accentuating their capabilities, okay? So first of all, let's make a distinction here between two types of gene editing. There's obviously there are attempts to restore patients, unhealthy people, okay, people who have a disease, or to prevent people from getting diseases that they're vulnerable to. Now, again, I asked you already, we already have agreed that that is a legitimate use of science and technology. It's a legitimate healthcare goal. But the means, if the means involves killing people to help or try to help other people, then a violation of human dignity and sanctity has taken place, and that should not happen, okay? But if you can do these genetic techniques in a way that does not endanger embryos, okay. And there's animal experimentation that's taking place. I don't know how you feel about that, but you may at least feel that that's better than experimentation on human embryos. Does that make sense? So at a certain level, we would simply say that we shouldn't be killing embryos in the process of making those things happen. And so some people might say, well, but you're essentially just nixing that research right there, because there's no way to make this work with, you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, right? The ends, health, justify the means. Experimentation on embryos. Now, that's not what you've been taught, is it? Have you been taught that the end justifies the means? That you can kill people whose value is sacred, made in God's image, in order to help other people? That's not what we're taught. That's not what we believe. We believe in the sanctity of human life and human dignity, objective moral value of every single human being, equally, as Josh Brahm emphasized today. But we are dealing with secular bioethicists who have too often embraced what we call utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. And if some embryos have to die in the process of refining this technology for the good of the rest of us, well then, we should do that, they would say. Which suggests, of course, that if we are going to effectively defend human life, we'd better at least know how to disarm those kinds of arguments, and justifies the means arguments. But, well, I only have so much time, and I'm like on page 2 or something of my notes, so we're just not going to get quite all the way there. I'll try to break early for at least some Q&A, by the way. So flag me down at maybe 10, maybe about 11:55 or so. But let's distinguish between trying to do gene editing for therapeutic purposes and gene editing for enhancement purposes. Now, what kinds of enhancements do you suppose people might want to do to themselves or their offspring? Just throw it out there. Intelligence. What else? Strength, muscular, yes. What else? Athletic ability. So make them a little taller, a little stronger, yeah. Intelligence. What else? Resistance to diseases, yes. Others? Metabolism. Ooh, okay. Yeah, burn that fat a little more efficiently. Yeah, okay. Sure, I wouldn't mind a higher metabolism. Huh? Looks. Now, tell me something. Does anybody doubt that looks is going to be a major part of what's going on there? I forget the numbers. I was just hearing this stuff. It was like tens of thousands of like breast augmentations. And how many people are getting their lips done? You know, they want those Mick Jagger lips. No, maybe it's Angelina Jolie. It's somebody, right? Or tummy tucks, Botox. I want to know how many Botox injections has Nancy Pelosi gotten. That's all I want to know, okay? Has anybody seen the before and after pictures of Michael Jackson? He doesn't look like the same person, okay? So if anybody doubts that we would sort of give rein to our vanity, desire for pleasure in all of this designer baby process, oh my goodness. Okay, so some of the concerns. One, we have to address this. By the way, how many of you have seen Captain America? Was he gene altered? Did it work out well for Captain America to be gene edited or whatever? You know, they did some genetic stuff there. That worked out pretty well, but did you see Red Skull, his enemy? I should have put his picture on there. He doesn't have a nose covering his nasal cavity, so you can see right into his soul, right there. And he's ugly as sin, but he's the evil gene-edited enemy. So for every Captain America, you're going to get a Red Skull. For every Spider-Man, you're going to get a Green Goblin or something, right? So, I mean, you'd think I'm just being frivolous, but I think that science fiction today is exploring the ethics and possible consequences of potential real-world possibilities with gene editing. Let's discuss just a bit, again, a couple of the concerns from a Christian point of view. I'm not even going to get to all the apologetic stuff I was trying to get to, but let's talk about the image of God. Let's try to look at this theologically, because before we can start making arguments to build common ground with people from a non-Christian perspective, we have to figure out what we think from a Christian perspective. We have to do our evaluation from within our worldview. So let's do this. We believe that, let's go back to the Garden of Eden for a second. Do you remember what the real temptation was that the serpent lured Adam and Eve into sin with was? You will become wise like God. Yes, knowing good and evil. Now, the way that, the best interpretation of that, of which I'm aware, and I did a little bit on this for my PhD dissertation on the image of God, which I just completed. So the best way, I think, to understand what that was about. It is not that God wanted to deny human beings a certain kind of knowledge. Okay, I've given for you to have this kind of knowledge, but this kind of knowledge, ixnay on the olognay. None of that, okay? It is that God was going to offer them the knowledge of right and wrong, but the way in which it would be gained would either be through obedience or disobedience. Now, the way that I substantiate that is from what Paul has to say about it in Colossians 3, when he goes back and he talks about when we are conformed to the image of Christ, we gain epigenosis, full knowledge. And it's the same term that the Greek Old Testament uses for the knowledge that they were tempted with in Genesis 3. Basically, Paul is saying that the knowledge Adam and Eve reached out for through disobedience was a knowledge that God wanted to give them through obedience and is now giving to us as Christians as he's remaking and renewing us in the image of Christ. So God was not saying, oh, here's a good thing, but no, you can't have it. He was saying, here's a good thing, but you've got to get it my way, not your way, and certainly not the serpent's way. But here are people trying to get knowledge not through renewal in the image of Christ, but through genetic manipulation at cost to all of these embryos. That history of human beings trying to accentuate knowledge by either doing evil or usurping the Creator's role, it is a long and sad history. And again, Hitler was trying to make a smarter human race because he thought the Aryans were the smart ones and these other people were the dumb ones, and boy, we better kill them off and not have them reproduce and have these other ones that are smarter reproduce. We should, because of that checkered history, be very wary of attempts to up the IQ of the human race. And by the way, you know what's not happening? All that time that we're trying to make us smarter by some IQ points, we're not learning how to love anymore. That process doesn't make us more self-effacing, more humble, more likely to serve others. It doesn't make us more gentle. It doesn't make our relationships any richer. It doesn't make us peacemakers. I go back again to the Captain America stuff. Before, the transformation happened to Captain America, the scientists guiding the experiment said, this process is going to basically take whatever is in you, personality or character-wise, and it's just going to, accentuate it. So if it's something that's really, if you have a cruelty in your character, it's going to exaggerate the cruelty. But if there's in Captain America's case, he was the guy jumping on a grenade to save everybody's life in his unit. You guys remember that scene? He jumps on the grenade, and Tommy Lee Jones looks at that, and it's impressive, but he says, he's still skinny. The same sorts of things could be in view with designer babies and gene editing of human beings. It's not going to change your moral character. You're going to end up using whatever your capacities are, now enhanced, in whatever way your moral character guides you to use them. And if that's victimizing another group and having power over other people, inappropriate power, if it's abuse, if it's whatever it is, those become even greater possibilities. So But let's talk a little bit about motive and intent for a second. Some of the motivation to do this, no doubt, has financial incentives, okay? I was thinking of an article I read recently that was talking about PEDs, performance-enhancing drugs that are used by professional athletes. How many of you guys are sports fans of any kind? Football's my sport. Any football fans in here? Okay, I love basketball too, and it's March Madness. Hey, Notre Dame ladies playing for the title again. I grew up in South Bend, Indiana, so go Irish. But this pitcher, this major league pitcher, was talking about how he feels pressured to take performance-enhancing drugs to throw faster, harder, better, because these other pitchers have no inhibitions about it. They're using PEDs, and if he doesn't enhance, one, he's going to fall behind them. So now you've got a competitive disadvantage if you don't use this. And two, his team will think, well, man, if you're not doing PEDs, then you're not as devoted and committed to the winning of our team as these other folks are. Now, think about gene editing and human enhancement. Won't those same things happen with human enhancement? Now, all of us will have to compete with the enhanced. And if their scores are off the charts and ours are along the, statistical norm, what you're going to do is you're going to widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Okay? And so, now how many of you realize that there is a certain political movement today to make sure that there's not a wide gap between the haves and have-nots? And what's their solution to every problem?
Bring the haves down to the have-nots.
And then bring the have-nots up by universal health care, universal education, free college, So they're going to try to redistribute to get rid of that gap. And the government is going to pay a lot of money to make sure that you don't have something that's available to the rich and not the poor. We already have a 20-something trillion dollar debt. It's only going to grow because we're going to make sure that that doesn't happen. So now somebody could hear all of this and say, well, you're just fear-mongering and you're talking about slippery slope. You know what a slippery slope is, right? It's when you make an argument that says, if this happens, then that'll happen, and that'll happen, and that'll happen, and that's an unlikely chain of events. But that's why, as we've gone through this, I've asked you, do you think it's likely that our vanity would come into play? Do you think it's likely that we would want to make sure that we're profitable and competitive with we're talking about common human nature, your understanding of human nature. And we know that that's not, yes, I did portray some steps that could fall, but they're not unlikely steps, are they? Okay. Now, by the way, what's God's plan for human renewal? Is it enhancement or is it resurrection and being perfected in moral character in the image of Jesus Christ? And that's a moral transformation. It is not primarily about getting IQ points. Now, I'll tell you this, though. When I read the description of the resurrection body in 1 Corinthians 15, 42 to 44, I read some pretty amazing stuff about how we'll be, sown in weakness, raised in what? Power? Okay? Raised in glory, raised incorruptible, which isn't just another way of saying immortal, but you won't decay in any of your abilities. You won't lose memory as you grow older, things like this. I really do think that the renewing power of the resurrection will positively affect your mind. For one thing, we'll never struggle with laziness, and we'll never use our IQs on things that are a waste to the neglect of these other things that are really more worth thinking about. We'll learn in eternity, I believe, And I believe we'll continue the project of human dominion in creation, because God's plan is not to suck our souls out of the world and go to heaven with them. His plan is to bring the New Jerusalem down out of heaven to the earth, right? And to renew us body and soul. And so human dominion continues. Revelation 22 says we serve God, but we reign with him as well. So human dominion continues in the new creation. For all those sorts of reasons, yeah, I think that the new human, the resurrected human, will have greater abilities than we do. We'll be in kind, we'll be the same sort of thing, but the effects of the fall will not detract from our capacities as they have before. But that's not what the post-humanists are trying to get. They're trying to fundamentally reshape human nature. They want a post-human, not a human, not a perfected human, post-humans. What's the next step in evolution? And they want to use genetics to get it. Do you see the difference between those two things? And we're trying to work for the renewal of human beings, not the transformation into some next species. Okay. Something else that I wanted to get to was this. If you can design your own babies, doesn't that detract from a sense of life as gift? There's a givenness to life, and when you get how many of you are parents, by the way? And when you first saw your little babies, now I'm going to embarrass the snot out of Jamie for a second. The first time I laid eyes on Jamie, I held her. She had just come out of quite a situation. The doctor gasped when she was born. And it wasn't like the born to be wild guy, gathered the nurses around and said, this one's born to be wild. This was different. The doctor was pulling the umbilical cord out and found that it was tied in a knot. Now, how many of you know what usually happens when an umbilical cord's tied? What? The baby suffocates and can't get its nutrients. It usually dies. And so the doctor called her a little miracle baby. And so she dropped that little tidbit on us, and I'm holding her for the first time knowing this, and I was crying like a baby, and she was sleeping calmly. I don't know, we kind of reversed roles there for a second. I was just completely overwhelmed with being a father for the first time, and this little baby, I just loved her so much. I was just, and gratitude. I felt the most profound gratitude that I've ever felt in my life, that God protected her inside my wife. Wow. I was blown away. But then they took her to the little, whatever that little lab is that they measure and they weigh the baby and all this. And she's in this little tray under a heat lamp as if she's like French fries or something. And she's laying there, and that's when I started calling her Froggy, because she just looked like a little frog kicking there. And so I threw her in some water, and she swam like a frog. No, I didn't do that. That was the next day. But we discovered very early on, in the first days of her life, that she simply didn't want to be bottled up. If you cuddled her too much and got her arms and legs together, she wanted to squirm free, and she just, don't fence me in, man. Just let me go. Let me be free. In contrast, our other daughter, Daphne, who was born a couple years later, she wanted to be cuddled, and she just sat there, and she just kind of just nuzzled all into you and just kind of, and when you're a new parent, you're just discovering what sort of person this is going to be. And you're telling your friends, oh, Daphne's a cuddler. She's really loving and affectionate. And Jamie's a don't fence me in kind of a person. And they're telling you, oh, give me a break. That doesn't tell you anything about their long-term character. And now that they're both grown, I can tell you, it tells you everything you need to know about their long-term character. No, it tells you something truthful. But you're getting to know this person for who she is. Not imposing upon her what sort of person you think she should be, because, hey, you had those genes edited to make her this way and not that way. Again, gene editing introduces a level of control over another person's life and detracts from the givenness. Let's just discover who this person is. Let's just get to know this person. My brother has a son with autism. And it really bothers him that he can't get to know his son as much as he would like to, because it's a challenge to to draw relational connection out of an autistic person. They tend to stay in their world. He wants to know his son. And I told him last time I was talking to him that the hope of the resurrection, he will not be raised with autism. He will be raised healthy. And you will know your son for eternity. And this time that you couldn't get to know him will be like ancient history you can barely remember 1 trillion years from right now. The point is, we think that God is the one who's doing the creating in the womb because he tells us that's what he's doing. He's knitting us together in the mother's womb, Psalm 139. But now we're going to monkey with it, and we're going to take God's place, usurp God's place, and start designing these babies the way we want them instead of the way God wants them? You know what's really interesting is that's a profoundly religious-sounding thing to say. But Michael Sandel from Harvard says that even from a secular perspective, designer babies detract from the givenness of life. Whether you think it's God or nature doing the giving, you just take people and accept them for who they are. Designer babies would keep us from just accepting people unconditionally because we made them to be this way and not that way. And that's just another way that we control, and they can disappoint us. I have to apologize, by the way. Your outlines were really about defending the humanity and personhood of the embryo, but I knew that I knew that this genetic thing was needed to be added in, but I didn't realize it was going to crowd out pretty much all the time to do the personhood defense. But is it nearly time? Should we do, okay, what time is it? Oh, 12:04. I see about a minute or so for questions and answers. Does somebody want to get out there? Question? Yes. If it's about survival, then it's a legitimate end of medicine. And if it's something that doctors are able to figure out how to do that without sacrificing a bunch of unborn babies in the process, then the safety and concern and the sanctity of human life can be potentially taken care of. So I don't have a problem with prenatal surgery if those conditions are met. Yes?